Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, Ukraine War News Update. No, it's not, it's a Frontline update. First one for about 5 days. This is actually yesterday's mapping update. It's already a little bit out of date, okay, so I do apologise about that. I did do the update yesterday, only have had time to record it today. So this is the 11th of January 2025, and this is a 5-day update. A lot will have changed on this map. It's why I don't bring you the daily Suret maps updates, because there'll just be so many of them over the 5 days. I would otherwise like to do that and like to do this daily, but time. Now you can see that there are a huge number of the wrong coloured pins. That's what you're going to expect when you have 5 days of Russian attacks all over the shop. We're going to start up in Kursk, where the Ukrainians, last time I spoke to you, the Ukrainians had attacked. They'd attacked in a number of different places. There's a lot of activity down here around the south of Sudzha. A reporter from Ukraine did a video on this. Here, the Suret map says the Russians have made some pretty substantial gains in Makhnovka, and they are fighting in there. I think it's safe to say it's probably a grey zone. They are doing a lot of attacking around here. The Ukrainians are hitting them in Makhnovka with FPV drones and hammering them down. I don't know that you could say it's like successfully and robustly controlled by the Russians, but they are operating around there. This is the main Ukrainian stronghold. This is where all these supplies come into the Kursk region, to Sudzha. So this is actually fairly worrying, as that is very close to Sudzha itself. We'll see how the Ukrainians deal with that. So last time I spoke to you, the Ukrainians have been pushing in a number of places and were doing something akin to a counterattack. I don't know how big it really was. They were just attacking a number of places with some columns. Now the Russians, they have pushed back in a big way. So they have, I don't know whether they were going to do this and the Ukrainians were kind of preempting them, and the Ukrainians have maybe seen the build-up of Russian forces. Nevertheless, the Russians have taken badly to the Ukrainians attacking around here and appear to have gone for it. They are counter-attacking in a really significant way here, and are supposedly, according to Suret maps and others, making gains around Darino here, making some gains there. Gains all along the east around Malaya Lokhnya, although the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back a little bit there. You can see the difference between these two mappers. Andrew Perpetua has the Russian defensive line a lot further back, as has often been the case around this in entire sector. And now both mappers agree that the Russians have pushed back in the north here, north of Malaya Lokhnya. Remember, I've said that they're coming from the south and coming from the west to try and cut off this sector. Well, actually, that sector seems to be not nearly as significant as it was. So remember, it was all the way out here, and now they have been pushed back really considerably there. Lots of activity going on in the north. Ukraine is potentially making some gains around Berdin. That's one of the areas that they pushed the Russians back in. Might have some kind of control over the village of Berdin and Novosotnitsky, as well as pushing the Russians back, at least according to Suret maps, north of Malaya Lokhnya in some of these villages there. And there's a lot of fighting over Pogrebki. So the Ukrainians supposedly retook Pogrebki at the beginning of this kind of counterattack. Now some Russian sources, or some sources claiming that the Russians have half taken that back. So we go back sort of 5 days or so. Russian reports 2 more Ukrainian thrusts, one near Tetkino, another near Novi Putny. So there were also claims of pushes around here. Tetkino is over there. And then I think here's Novi Putny. So another one towards Glushkovo's kind of area. Is that right? Or yes. It seems to have... Where's Glushkovo gone? Further to the north. I don't know. Oh yeah, there it is. So possibly 2 other vectors of attack there, but we haven't really heard much about that since that was claimed. We had claims of Ukrainians taking some land near Berdin. That's what I was just talking about. That was sort of 5 days ago. Then Pogrebki, as I was just mentioning there, the capture of that village was claimed to have taken place on the 7th, now 4 days later. And then here we have Mykolaiivka in the Kursk Oblast as well. That is, I believe, over in... because there's been a lot of fighting around Novoivanivka again, Kruglenkoye. So yes, there was just a lot of fighting all over the shop. But a couple of days of no reports saying, well, as we said in previous situation in Kursk is rapidly deteriorating for Ukrainian forces. It's now confirmed that geolocated footage at Ukraine lost Ruskoye Porochnaya, and that Russians are advancing towards Kozitsa. So we put that on the map. That is talking about this area directly in the kind of north central part of the Kursk sector. You've got Ruskoye Porochnaya there. That the Suriyat maps here saying that the Russians have taken back control of and are pushing towards Kozitsa. That's what Null Reports are saying as well. Andrew Perpetua, although he's made a mapping change since then, so actually his map will probably look a little bit different. But anyway, that's there's a big difference between the two mappers there. I'd expect that he would change his mapping to align more with Null Reports and Suriyat maps there. So Kursk is looking really, really difficult for the Ukrainians. The Russians are massively pushing there. They are going to want as much of this back by the 20th. They've got 9 days to be as productive as possible in regaining territory there, because the inauguration they'll want to have their troops having as much momentum and taking as much land as possible, to then, if they are forced immediately into negotiations, they'll be in the best position possible. They're pushing it all over the shop, so up in the Kupiansk area, further to the south in the Pischany sector, and then further down to the south around Terny and Torska and Mykiivka, and then even around Siversk area and Chaziv Yar and Toretsk, which they now pretty much control. Anyway, we'll look at these all individually. I won't spend too much time. Some minor advances on the west of the Oskil River, as according to both mappers. One Suriyat maps around Dvorichna, and further to the south as far as Andrew Perpetua is concerned, just a small area of forest taken there. That's not crazy bad for 5 days, but I think it's worrying that they're that side of the river. Then some more gains south of the Pischany sector. I call it the Pischany sector. It's the one where they've reached the Oskil River. Around here, Ukrainian channels have claimed that the Ukrainians have counterattacked. Actually, that's Kolesnivka. Oops, what's going on? Yes, so exactly where we were there. Kolesnikivka. Trying to get all of these words properly pronounced and failing dismally. So the Ukrainians had counterattacked there, and that was coming from Grey Skull on the 8th. So sort of 2 days before this update, it could be that the Ukrainians have retaken some land just there. Just trying to see exactly where that is. It's right there. So that is here, which is already under the control of the Ukrainians, as according to both mappers there. So obviously Grayskull had a slightly different mapping interpretation, but it could be that the Ukrainians are pressuring up there. Otherwise, the Russians are taking land to the south of that sector. A little bit of pressure around Mykiivka. Andrew Perpetua, actually, Suriyat maps has already got way more Russian control around there than Andrew, but Andrew adding a little bit of land there. And then around these water features near Terny, the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians really quite far back, according to Suriyat maps. So take it with a pinch of salt, but if that's true, then that's really quite significant. Well over the Zherebets River here. Terny largely under their control, as according to Suriyat maps, and making a bid for Bilahorivka, not the one that's down by the chalk mines. There's a different Bilahorivka and Yampolivka there. Under a lot of pressure from the Russians. Andrew Perpetua, slightly less charitable than Suriyat maps, but still has the Russians pushing over to the west of the water features there. So that's not looking too good for the Ukrainians there. And then a huge difference in the mappers around, well, actually all around the Siversk front. So the Bilahorivka area, there's a big difference between the two mappers there. I think Suriyat maps in this area is being particularly erroneous. I don't think the Russians have control of this mountains there, or I don't know if mountain's the correct word, somewhere between a large hill and a mountain. And yeah, the claims from Suryatmats are very charitable to the Russians around here. And also further to the south around Voknokomianska and further around Ivano-Dorivka, which is, there's not a lot of settlement around here. This is quite undulating land. And what does control mean when you have vast areas like this? This was that tiny village that there were some people seen in it ages ago, and you couldn't work out whether they're Russians or Ukrainians. And then Suryatmats, just because there's a couple of people there, filled in all of this area, then took it back, then filled it in again. And it's been fairly dynamic around here. But he seems to be confident that the Russians control vast swathes of this land, and Andrew Perpetua not so confident there. So huge differences around the Siversk front line. We come down to Chaziv Yar, and some fairly significant gains for the Russians in the northern part of Chaziv Yar. Well, I say that it's only this extra area. Suryatmats had the Russians in control of here. Andrew Perpetua doesn't, and so that's quite a significant difference. It's probably that this is a grey zone. There's lots of difficult fighting here. Remember, we're in January now, and Chaziv Yar was supposed to have fallen to the Russians in summer, and that was according to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were expecting that to have fallen. They're still fighting over Chaziv Yar, so I guess that's one good thing, that there's still fierce fighting there. Toretsk appears to be, or it's all over for Toretsk. The Russians largely in control of the whole settlement. Indeed, if we look at, well, initially here, this is actually from yesterday, pro-Ukrainian channel reports that Ukrainians successfully counterattacked in Zabalka area in Toretsk. So that is around here. Naturally, Andrew Perpetua has that, that there is a counterattack that's taken place there. So that's really good, really good news, that the Ukrainians haven't 100% given up on this area. And there's that pocket between where the Russians have got to north of New York up to Leonidivka. But there's that pocket of Ukrainian control in between. But Andrew Perpetua has said that even though there's that area there of where the Ukrainians have retaken it, he's got that as kind of grey zone now. But the Russian control pushed back. Remember, that's the case with my mapping. It's the grey zone. So it's not the Ukrainians control up to that blue line. For Andrew Perpetua, that's where the Russian defensive line is. This will be grey zone. And in fact, you can see it perfectly on this map. So the Russians have control of the red area. The yellow area is grey zone, and this green area is where the Ukrainians control. So they do have this thin patch of land between these two salients, which looks fairly dangerous for them. But he has said Toretsk is essentially major map update for January the 10th. Russians have effectively captured Toretsk. Grey zone, large grey zone to the north there, but the Russians are largely in control of the city of Toretsk. So that is, I mean, we knew that was going to happen, but it's still, it's not good news to see that. Then in this northern part of the sector, where we haven't seen a lot of activity for a long time here, the Ukrainians are being pushed back between Yelizativka and Vozdvizenka. Now, this is on the way to interdicting that T0504 highway that goes all the way to Konstantinivka and indeed past there into Chaziv Yar and Bakhmut. So that road that comes down there through Stupochki, Konstantinivka, all the way down here. And we were talking a long time ago about how the Russians were on the very precipice there in terms of interdicting physically that road. It's under fire control, so you wouldn't want to drive that, be running the gauntlet. But the Russians have been stopped there for an awful long time, and now we see a little bit of movement, which is slightly worrying. I just thought I did have something on there, but anyway, some people talking about that today. And then we have the Pokrovsk area, which is increasingly challenging for the Ukrainians as the Russians are moving up towards the western side of it, trying to get some kind of encirclement. I think the Ukrainian main fortifications lie along here, and that's why you haven't seen too much Russian advance there, but they are preferring to go around Pokrovsk and cause all sorts of problems for the pretty much now mainly evacuated town, although they're still active there. I was speaking in my live stream the other night to Anton from Base UA. He was telling us about how back when Shevchenko wasn't under control of the Russians, he was doing evacuations there, and his van got hit just on this road here by 2 Russian drones that slammed one into the back, one into the side. They all survived, but it shook them up somewhat. This is very dangerous around here, but there are still evacuations taking place. But as you can see, the Russians making some gains towards its southwest and a little bit directly south as well. Fierce fighting around there. And then the Russians are continuing to make these gains, filling in the areas around Kurakhove. Andrew Perpetua now pretty much agreeing with Surat maps around this region. Kurakhove has fallen, thermal power plant has been fought over, and they are now trying to advance further to the west. Not as much, considering that's 5 days, actually, Surat maps hasn't shown too much gain around here. And it goes back to something I reported yesterday, which is, was it the ISW or someone else reporting that the Russians are fairly exhausted around this area, that they are slowing down around here in their gains, so actually for 5 days it's not the worst, but the Ukrainians do need to stop the Russians from advancing, obviously, but that I think would require many more people. Like I've said, that if you've got a lack of boots on the ground, then you have to replace boots with drones, but drones can't control tree lines really. You can have some kind of fire control over them, but in order to say that you control this town or city, you need people there to do that, and they are just lacking in people. But they're trying to make up with it in other ways, drones and artillery and whatnot. But the Russians are advancing. They are taking heavy casualties, of course. Andrew Perpetua shows a few more gains for the Russians around Velika Novosilka. In fact, I think that's where we have some claims here. No, it's Kurakhove thermal power plant, intense fighting there. It's become one of the focal points. There isn't. There was some talk about a lot of fiber optic drones. I think Russians operating lots of fiber optic drones around Velika Novosilka. So that's pretty challenging for the Ukrainians. They have put out to some of their drone manufacturers that they really need fiber optic drones, and they are getting them. There are some claims that they're being used. Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians are using them a lot up in Kursk and a few other places. But there are certain places where the Russians just have the advantage still there. The Ukrainians both need to produce their own fiber optic drones en masse, but also they need some countermeasures to these fiber optic drones. So challenging for them. Some tiny gains here in the south as well, around Novokarlivka there, but nothing too much to report. There's been quite a bit of activity. We mentioned the Kimburn Peninsula, as the Ukrainians appear to be operating some half-decent boats around here, and the Russians are having quite a hard time when they're doing their meat assaults, I think, into these islands in the estuary, and taking quite a beating, while the Ukrainians are also, I think, hammering the Russians on the peninsula with artillery and drones and whatnot. But obviously no movement there. So the question is, was that counterattack all the Ukrainians have? Is that the only ability they've got in terms of reserves to try and shift the momentum? Was that a wily way of getting the Russians to counterattack so that the Ukrainians could trip the Russians, bring them out, sort of bait them out into attacking because they're so worried that Ukrainians might be taking some ground there? Are the Ukrainians going to be attacking anywhere else, or is that literally all we can expect from them? And if that is, then it shows how desperate they are for manpower. They are getting enough equipment, it appears, both in terms of ammunition, artillery ammunition, But as the war goes on, things like HIMARS, you require sending more of those missiles because of the electronic warfare that's been fairly effective on them. There was a claim the other day that 40% is the success rate for HIMARS. So you need a lot of missiles to make them effective. The same with a lot of the precision guided munitions. But in terms of equipment, I think the Ukrainians are probably doing all right for equipment. They just need the people, of course. Let me know what you think. That's the Frontline update for realistically the 10th, but it's the 11th today. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.